The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty ranch as Margaret Thompson stood at her kitchen window, watching her last remaining horse graze in the small paddock behind the weather barn. Thunder, a magnificent chestnut stallion with a white blaze down his face, had been her husband's pride and joy. Now, 3 years after James's passing, Thunder was all she had left of the life they'd built together on this remote piece of land in the Arizona Territory. Margaret's weathered hands wrapped around her coffee cup as she studied the horse through the cracked glass. At 62, she felt every one of her years in her aching joints and tire bones. The ranch that had once bustled with activity now felt hollow and empty. The other horses had been sold off one by one to pay for medicine during James's final illness, to cover the funeral expenses, and to keep food on the table during the harsh winter months. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the dirt road that led to her property. A rider was coming slowly, swaying dangerously in his saddle. Margaret set down her coffee and stepped onto the porch, shielding her eyes against the glare of the morning sun. As the figure drew closer, she could see he was a Native American man, probably Apache from his appearance, and he was clearly in distress. The man's horse, a tired-looking mare, stumbled to a stop near Margaret's front gate. The rider slumped forward, barely conscious, and Margaret could see dark stains on his shirt that looked suspiciously like blood. Without hesitation, she hurried down the porch steps and across the yard, her heart pounding with concern and a touch of fear. "Mister, are you all right?" she called out as she approached. The man raised his head slightly, revealing a face marked by pain and exhaustion. He appeared to be in his 30s, with long black hair and traditional Apache clothing that was torn and stained. A makeshift bandage around his left shoulder was soaked with blood. "Please," he whispered in heavily accented English, his voice barely audible. "My horse, she cannot go further. I need—" His words trailed off as he swayed again, nearly falling from the saddle. Margaret didn't hesitate. Despite her age and the fact that she was alone on the ranch, something in the man's eyes spoke to her of genuine desperation rather than any threat. "Easy now," she said gently, reaching up to help steady him. "Let me help you down from there." With considerable effort, Margaret managed to help the wounded Apache dismount. He was heavier than she expected, and his weight nearly sent them both tumbling to the ground. She could see now that he had multiple injuries beyond the shoulder wound, scratches on his face and arms, and what looked like a bullet graze along his ribs. "What happened to you?" Margaret asked as she supported him toward the house. The man's horse stood with her head hanging low, sides heaving with exhaustion. "Soldiers," the Apache man managed to say between labored breaths. They think I steal cattle." "I did not. But they shoot anyway." His English was broken, but understandable, and Margaret could hear the pain in every word. "Well, whoever shot you, we need to get those wounds cleaned up before infection sets in," Margaret said practically. She had learned a good deal about treating injuries during her husband's final months, and her frontier upbringing had taught her basic medical care. "Can you make it to the house?" The man nodded weakly, and together they made their slow way across the yard. Margaret's mind was racing as she helped him up the porch steps. She knew that harboring a wounded Apache could bring trouble. Relations between the local settlers and the various Apache bands were tense at best. But she also couldn't turn away someone who was clearly suffering and in need of help. Once inside, Margaret helped the man to a chair at her kitchen table. In the better light, she could see that his injuries were serious, but probably not life-threatening if properly treated. The shoulder wound appeared to be from a rifle bullet that had passed clean through, while the other injuries looked like they came from falling or being dragged through brush during an escape. "What's your name?" Margaret asked as she gathered medical supplies from her cabinet. "Joseph," the man replied, then added something in Apache that she didn't understand. "Joseph Bluehawk. And you are very kind, old woman." Margaret almost smiled at the blunt description. "Margaret Thompson. This is my ranch, or what's left of it." She began to clean the shoulder wound carefully, noting how the man tensed but didn't cry out. "This Joseph Bluehawk, that's not an Apache name." "Mission school," Joseph explained through gritted teeth as Margaret worked. "Priests give us white names. Say our real names are pagan." The last word was spoken with clear distaste. "And what's your real name?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious. Joseph looked at her for a long moment, as if deciding whether to trust her with this information. "Nailnish," he said finally. "It means..." He works, but most whites cannot say it right. Margaret nodded as she applied a clean bandage to the shoulder wound. Nailnish, she repeated, managing a reasonable approximation of the pronunciation. That's a good name. A strong name. Surprise flickered across Joseph's face. It was probably the first time in years that a white person had bothered to learn his real name, let alone use it correctly. You are not like other whites I have met, he said quietly. I suppose not, Margaret replied as she moved on to cleaning the other wounds. My husband always said I was too trusting for my own good. He might have been right about that. As she worked, Margaret found herself studying this unexpected visitor. Despite his injuries and obvious exhaustion, there was a dignity about Joseph Blue Hawk that impressed her. He bore the pain stoically, never complaining or asking for special treatment. His eyes, when they met hers, held intelligence and a kind of weary wisdom that spoke of someone who had seen too much trouble in his life. These soldiers who shot you, Margaret said as she finished cleaning the wounds. They'll likely be looking for you. It's not safe for you to travel in daylight, especially with your horse in such poor condition. Joseph nodded grimly. I know, but I cannot stay long. Too dangerous for you if they find me here. Margaret looked out the window at Joseph's horse, which was now drinking deeply from the water trough near the barn. The poor animal was clearly exhausted and wouldn't be able to carry a rider much further without rest. Your horse needs at least a day to recover, she said. Maybe two. I cannot ask you to take such risk, Joseph protested. If soldiers come. Let me worry about the soldiers, Margaret interrupted. I've been dealing with men in uniform my whole life, first with my husband in the war, then with various officials who come around here over the years. I know how to handle myself. Joseph studied her face carefully. Why do you help me? Most of your people would have shot first and asked questions later. Margaret paused in her bandaging, considering the question. My husband used to say that kindness doesn't cost anything, but the lack of it costs everything. I guess I believe that. She finished securing the bandage and stepped back. Besides, you're hurt, and your horse is exhausted. What kind of Christian would I be if I turned you away? Christian, Joseph repeated the word with a slight frown. Mission priests were Christians too. They try to beat the Apache out of us with their Christian love. Margaret winced at the bitterness in his voice. Not all Christians are like those priests, she said quietly. Some of us actually try to live by the teachings instead of just preaching them. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, studying Margaret's face as if trying to decide whether to believe her. Finally, he nodded slowly. Perhaps you were right. But still, I should not stay long. You'll stay until you're strong enough to travel safely, Margaret said firmly. And until your horse is rested. That's final. Despite his exhaustion and pain, Joseph almost smiled at the determination in the older woman's voice. It reminded him of his grandmother, who had spoken with the same kind of quiet authority that brooked no argument. Margaret showed Joseph to the small guest room that had once been used for traveling ranch hands. It was simply furnished, but clean, with a comfortable bed and a window that looked out over the desert landscape. You should rest, she told him. I'll check on your horse and make sure she has everything she needs. As Joseph gratefully sank onto the bed, Margaret went outside to tend to his mare. The horse was still drinking water, and Margaret could see old scars on her coat that suggested a hard life. She was a sturdy animal, probably around 15 years old, with the kind of endurance that came from Apache breeding and training. You've carried your rider a long way, haven't you, girl? Margaret murmured as she examined the horse. The mare's ribs were showing, indicating that food had been scarce lately. Margaret led her to the small corral next to Thunder's paddock and gave her a generous portion of hay and grain. Thunder, meanwhile, had noticed the new arrival and was standing at the fence line, ears pricked forward with interest. The two horses studied each other across the fence, and Margaret could see the instant recognition that passed between them. They were both creatures of the desert, adapted to the harsh conditions, and capable of surviving where softer horses would perish. As Margaret watched the horses, she found herself thinking about the man resting in her guest room. There was something about Joseph Blue Hawk that reminded her of the wild Mustangs she and James used to see roaming the desert, proud, independent, and wary of humans, but not inherently hostile. He had been shaped by hardship and persecution, just as the wild horses had been shaped by drought and predators. The rest of the day passed quietly. Margaret prepared a simple meal of stew and cornbread, checking on Joseph periodically. He slept deeply, the exhaustion of his ordeal finally catching up with him. She noticed that even in sleep, his hand remained near the knife at his belt, the reflexes of someone who had learned never to fully let down his guard. As evening approached, Margaret sat on her porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Thunder and Joseph's mare were grazing peacefully in their adjacent paddocks, the day's heat giving way to the blessed coolness of evening. It had been a long time since there had been another person on the ranch, and Margaret found that she was enjoying the company, even if her guest was too injured to be much of a conversationalist. The sound of movement from inside the house told her that Joseph was awake. A few minutes later, he appeared on the porch, moving carefully but looking much better after his rest. The color had returned to his face, and his eyes were clearer. "How are you feeling?" Margaret asked, gesturing for him to sit in the chair beside her. "Better," Joseph admitted, settling gingerly into the chair. "Much better. Thank you for—" He gestured vaguely, encompassing the medical care, the rest, and the general kindness. "No need to thank me," Margaret said. "How long since you've had a proper meal?" Joseph considered the question. 3 days, maybe 4. I had some dried meat, but— He shrugged, indicating it hadn't been much. "Well, you'll eat well while you're here," Margaret said firmly. "I may not have much, but I've always got enough for one more at the table." As they sat together in the gathering twilight, Margaret found herself curious about her unexpected guest. "If you don't mind me asking, what were you doing when these soldiers found you?" Joseph was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally, he spoke. "I was looking for my sister." "Your sister?" "She was taken 5 years ago. Soldiers raided our camp, said we were harboring renegades. They killed some, took others to reservation. I have been searching ever since." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard stories of such raids, usually dismissed as exaggerated tales from disgruntled settlers. But the pain in Joseph's voice was unmistakably real. "5 years is a long time to search," she said gently. "She is all the family I have left," Joseph replied simply. "Our parents died in the winter sickness 10 years ago. Our brother was killed in a fight with soldiers 3 years past. Ayana is all I have." "Ayana? That's her name?" Joseph nodded. "It means eternal blossom in our language. She was always laughing, always happy, like a flower that bloomed even in the desert." His voice grew softer, and Margaret could hear the love and worry in every word. "Have you found any trace of her?" "Sometimes. A Mexican trader told me he saw Apache women at Fort Bowie 6 months ago. A rancher near Tucson said soldiers passed through with Apache prisoners last winter. But always when I arrive, they have been moved somewhere else." Margaret shook her head sadly. The policy of moving Native American populations from place to place seemed designed to break up families and destroy tribal bonds. "That must be heartbreaking." "It is," Joseph admitted, "but I cannot stop looking. She is my responsibility." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. Margaret found herself thinking about her own losses, James's death, the gradual dissolution of their dreams for the ranch, the loneliness that had become her constant companion. But at least she had been able to bury her husband properly and grieve in her own home. Joseph had been searching for 5 years without even knowing if his sister was still alive. "Tell me about your ranch," Joseph said, breaking the silence. "You and your husband built this place." Margaret nodded, grateful for the change of subject. "We came out here in '68, right after the war ended. James had served with the cavalry, and he'd fallen in love with this country during his service. Said it was the most beautiful place on earth." "It is beautiful," Joseph agreed, looking out over the moonlit desert. "Hard but beautiful, like my people." James felt the same way. He said the desert taught a man what really mattered: water, shelter, and someone to share the sunset with. "Your husband sounds like a wise man." "He was," Margaret said softly. "He died 3 years ago. Cancer. Took him slowly, but he never complained. Said he was grateful for every day we'd had together. And now you are alone here." It wasn't a question, and Margaret nodded. "Mostly. Sometimes I think about selling, moving to town where life would be easier. But this place, it's where James and I were happiest. I can't quite bring myself to leave it." Joseph was quiet for a moment. In Apache tradition, when someone dies, we sometimes burn their belongings and move to a new place. We believe their spirit might linger otherwise, unable to begin the journey to the next world. Do you believe that? Joseph shrugged. I do not know, but I understand why you stay. Some places hold pieces of our hearts. Margaret looked at this man who had wandered into her life just that morning. Despite the differences in their backgrounds and the circumstances that had brought them together, she felt a kinship with him. They were both people who had lost those they loved, both struggling to find meaning in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving. Your horse seems better, Margaret said, changing the subject again. Yes, the rest and food have helped her greatly. But she's old like me. This search, it has been hard on both of us. Margaret studied Joseph's profile in the moonlight. Despite his injuries and obvious exhaustion, he didn't look particularly old to her. How long have you had her? 15 years. Since she was a foal. I helped deliver her when her mother died in the birthing. Raised her on goat's milk and honey. 15 years, Margaret repeated. That's a long partnership. She is more than a horse to me. She is my companion, my friend. Without her, Joseph's voice trailed off, but Margaret understood. In his solitary search for his sister, the horse had been his only constant companion. What's her name? Guy. It means White Mountain in Apache. When she was young, she loved to climb the rocky hills. Margaret smiled. That's a beautiful name. Much more fitting than some English name would be. Joseph looked surprised again by her acceptance of his culture. Most whites think our names are primitive. Most whites don't bother to learn what they mean, Margaret replied. I think names should tell a story about who someone is, not just sound pretty. They talked for another hour, sharing stories about their horses, their losses, and their hopes for the future. Margaret found Joseph to be intelligent and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that occasionally showed through his natural reserve. He, in turn, seemed amazed by her willingness to treat him as an equal rather than a curiosity or a threat. Eventually, the cool night air and Joseph's obvious fatigue drove them inside. Margaret checked his bandages one more time before they retired, pleased to see that the wounds were already beginning to heal cleanly. Thank you, Joseph said as they prepared to part for the night. Not just for the medicine and food, but for... He struggled to find the right words in English. For treating you like a person, Margaret suggested gently. Joseph nodded. It has been a long time since someone showed me such kindness without expecting anything in return. Well, you might change your mind when you see how early I get up, Margaret said with a slight smile. I'll try not to wake you, but the chickens don't much care about sleeping in. As Margaret settled in her own bed that night, she reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. This morning she had been alone on a failing ranch, facing an uncertain future with only an aging horse for company. Tonight, she was sheltering a wounded Apache warrior who was searching for his lost sister. It wasn't the kind of situation her younger self could have imagined, but somehow it felt right. Outside her window, she could hear the soft sounds of the horses moving around their paddocks. Thunder's familiar whinny was answered by a softer sound from Gay, and Margaret smiled in the darkness. Even the horses seemed to understand that sometimes unexpected friendships could develop between the most unlikely companions. As sleep finally claimed her, Margaret's last conscious thought was a prayer for Joseph's sister Ayanna, wherever she might be. No one should have to search for 5 years to find their family. And no one should have to make that search alone. Margaret woke before dawn, as was her habit. The house was quiet, and when she checked on Joseph, she found him still sleeping peacefully. His color looked better, and his breathing was steady and unlabored. She decided to let him rest and went about her morning chores quietly. The chickens were already stirring in their coop, eager for their morning feed. As Margaret scattered grain for them, she noticed Thunder and Gay standing near each other at the fence line between their paddocks. The Apache mare looked much improved after a night of rest and good food, though Margaret could see she would need several more days before she'd be ready for hard travel. After finishing with the chickens, Margaret checked the small vegetable garden she maintained behind the house. The tomatoes were coming along well, and there were enough beans and squash to make a decent meal. She picked what she needed for breakfast and returned to the house, still moving quietly to avoid waking her guest. The smell of bacon frying eventually brought Joseph from his room. He appeared in the kitchen doorway looking much better than he had the day before, though he still moved carefully to avoid jarring his injured shoulder. Good morning, Margaret said. How did you sleep? Very well, Joseph replied, and she could see he was telling the truth. Better than I have in many weeks. Your bed is much softer than the ground. Margaret smiled. I imagine it would be. Sit down, and I'll get you some breakfast. You need to eat well to help those wounds heal. As they ate together, Margaret found herself studying her guest more carefully in the morning light. Despite his injuries and the hardships he had clearly endured, there was something about Joseph that spoke of inner strength and resilience. His hands, she noticed, were calloused from hard work, but also surprisingly gentle when he handled his coffee cup or reached for the bread. "Your mare looks much better this morning," Margaret observed. Joseph nodded. "The rest has helped her greatly, but she's still tired. Another day or two, and she will be ready to travel again. Where will you go next in your search?" Joseph was quiet for a moment, and Margaret saw something like despair flicker across his face. "I do not know," he admitted. "I had heard there were Apache women at a settlement near Phoenix, but when I arrived there 2 weeks ago, I learned they had been moved again. The trail grows cold." 5 years is a long time," Margaret said gently. Maybe she is dead," Joseph finished. "Yes, I've thought of this many times. But until I know for certain, I must continue looking." Margaret admired his determination even as her heart went out to him. She tried to imagine searching for a lost loved one for 5 years with no certain knowledge of their fate. The not knowing would be almost worse than death itself. "What was your sister like?" she asked, hoping to steer the conversation toward happier memories. Joseph's expression softened. "Is the light of our family. Even when times were hardest, she found reasons to laugh. She loved animals, had a way with horses that even impressed our grandfather, who was known as the best horse trainer in our band. She was young when she was taken, 16, old enough to be considered a woman by our traditions, but still so young." Joseph's voice grew heavy with pain. "She had just begun learning the sacred songs from our grandmother. She was going to be a healer, like our grandmother before her." Margaret felt a chill at the thought of a 16-year-old girl torn from her family and everything she knew. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That must have been terrible for all of you." "The worst part," Joseph continued, "was that I was away when it happened. I had gone with some other men to hunt elk in the mountains. We were gone for 8 days. When we returned," he shook his head, unable to finish the sentence. "It wasn't your fault," Margaret said firmly. "I was her brother, her protector. I should have been there. And if you had been there, you probably would have been killed or taken too. Then there would be no one to search for her." Joseph looked at Margaret for a long moment, as if this perspective had never occurred to him. "Perhaps," he said finally, "but the guilt, it does not leave." Margaret understood that feeling all too well. After James died, she had tortured herself with thoughts of what she could have done differently. If she had insisted he see a doctor sooner, if she had been more attentive to the early symptoms, if she had prayed harder. The list of if-onlys could drive a person mad. "Guilt is like a poison," she said. "It eats away at you from the inside until there's nothing left. Your sister wouldn't want that for you." "No," Joseph agreed quietly. "She would tell me to stop being foolish and eat more. She was always trying to feed people." Margaret smiled. She sounded like a wise young woman. They finished breakfast in companionable silence, and afterwards, Margaret insisted on changing Joseph's bandages. The wounds were healing well, with no signs of infection, but they were still tender and needed careful attention. "You have good hands for healing," Joseph observed as Margaret worked. "Have you done much of this?" "More than I wanted to," Margaret replied. "When you live this far from town, you learn to take care of yourself and others. I tended my husband during his final illness, and before that, various ranch hands had got injured or sick. It is a gift," Joseph said. "My grandmother always said that healing hands were blessed by the spirits." Margaret found herself surprisingly moved by the compliment. It had been a long time since anyone had praised her abilities or made her feel useful. "Thank you," she said simply. As she worked, Margaret became aware of how close they were sitting, how intimate the act of tending someone's wounds could be. Joseph held very still, but she could sense the tension in his body and knew it wasn't entirely due to pain. There was something else, an awareness between them that went beyond the simple relationship between helper and helped. When she finished with the bandages, they moved apart quickly, both sensing the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Margaret busied herself with cleaning up the medical supplies while Joseph moved to look out the window at the horses. "They seem to have become friends," he observed, watching Thunder and Gay grazing near each other. "Yes, they have," Margaret agreed, grateful for the safer topic of conversation. "Thunder hasn't had much company since the other horses were sold." I think he's enjoying having someone his own kind around. Horses are social animals. They need companionship to be truly happy. Like people, Margaret said without thinking, then immediately regretted the comment. It revealed too much about her own loneliness. Joseph turned from the window to look at her. Yes, he said quietly. Like people. Their eyes met across the room, and Margaret felt her breath catch. There was something in Joseph's gaze that spoke of understanding, of shared loneliness, and the recognition of kindred spirits. For a moment, the air between them seemed charged with possibility. Then, the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the moment. Margaret hurried to the window and felt her stomach drop when she saw 6 soldiers in blue uniforms riding up the dirt road toward her ranch. "Soldiers," she said tersely, and Joseph was immediately alert. "They come for me," he said, moving toward the back of the house. "Wait," Margaret said, her mind racing. "Let me handle this. Get in the root cellar behind the kitchen. There's a trapdoor under the rug. Don't come out until I give you the all clear." Joseph hesitated. "If they find me here, you will be in trouble too." "Let me worry about that," Margaret said firmly. "Go. Now." Joseph quickly made his way to the back of the house while Margaret composed herself and stepped out onto the front porch. The soldiers were already dismounting, and she recognized their leader as Lieutenant Collins, a young officer she had encountered several times in town. He was ambitious and officious, the kind of man who followed regulations to the letter without much thought for the human consequences. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," Lieutenant Collins said, touching his hat brim politely, but not quite respectfully. "We're tracking a dangerous Apache renegade who was seen in this area yesterday. We need to search your property." "Good morning, Lieutenant," Margaret replied calmly. "I haven't seen any Apache renegades around here. What makes you think he came this way?" "We tracked him to within a few miles of your ranch," Collins said. "He's wounded and on foot now. His horse gave out about 5 miles back. He's armed and considered extremely dangerous." Margaret kept her expression neutral, though her heart was pounding. Joseph's horse hadn't given out. She was right there in the paddock, looking much better after a night of rest. But apparently the soldiers had lost the trail. "Well, as I said, I haven't seen anyone," Margaret said. "But you're welcome to look around if you think it's necessary." Collins nodded and gestured to his men. "Search the barn and outbuildings first. Then we'll check the house." Margaret watched nervously as the soldiers spread out across her property. 2 of them went to the barn, while another checked the chicken coop and the small shed where she stored tools. A 4th soldier was examining the ground around the paddocks, looking for tracks. "That's a fine horse you have there, Mrs. Thompson," Collins said, gesturing toward Thunder. "Apache breed, isn't he?" "He might have some Apache blood in him," Margaret replied carefully. "My husband traded for him years ago. Never asked too many questions about his bloodlines." Collins nodded absently, then frowned as he looked more closely at the 2 horses. "Strange. Looks like you've got 2 horses there." Margaret's mouth went dry. In her concern about hiding Joseph, she had completely forgotten about Zit-Dit-Gay. The mare was clearly visible in the paddock next to Thunder, and she obviously wasn't one of Margaret's regular horses. "Oh, that one," Margaret said, thinking frantically. "She showed up yesterday, probably escaped from someone's herd. I pinned her up thinking someone would come looking for her." "Did you now?" Collins said, his tone becoming suspicious. "Mind if we take a closer look at her?" "Of course not," Margaret said, though her heart was racing. As they walked toward the paddock, she prayed that Joseph was well hidden and that the mare wouldn't do anything to give away her Apache training. Collins climbed the fence and approached Zit-Dit-Gay carefully. The mare stood her ground, watching him with alert but calm eyes. "She's in good condition for a stray," he observed. "Well fed, recently groomed. This horse belongs to someone. Like I said, she just showed up yesterday," Margaret insisted. "Maybe she escaped recently." Collins continued his examination of the horse, running his hands along her neck and back. Margaret held her breath as he checked the mare's legs and hooves, looking for any sign that she had been recently ridden hard. "Fresh shoes," Collins announced grimly. "And look at this, saddle marks on her back. This horse was being ridden within the last day or 2. Margaret's mind raced as she tried to think of an explanation. Maybe whoever lost her was out riding recently. "Mrs. Thompson," Collins interrupted, his voice becoming stern. "This horse matches the description of the mount being used by the Apache we're tracking. Now, I'm going to ask you one more time. Have you seen anything suspicious around here? Before Margaret could answer, one of the soldiers called out from near the barn. Lieutenant, you need to see this. Collins jumped down from the paddock and strode quickly toward the barn, with Margaret following reluctantly behind. Her worst fears were realized when she saw what the soldier had found, Joseph's bloody shirt, which had been discarded after Margaret cleaned his wounds. Well, Collins said, holding up the torn and blood-stained garment. What do we have here? Margaret's mind went blank. There was no innocent explanation for a bloody Apache shirt hidden in her barn, and she knew it. I can explain, she began, though she had no idea what she was going to say. I'm sure you can, Collins said coldly. Sergeant Williams, search the house. Tear it apart if you have to. He's here somewhere. Lieutenant, please, Margaret tried again. I can explain everything. Save your explanations for the territorial judge, Collins snapped. Harboring hostile Indians is a federal crime, Mrs. Thompson. You're looking at serious prison time. Margaret watched helplessly as the soldiers spread out to search every inch of her property. It was only a matter of time before they found the root cellar and discovered Joseph. She tried to think of some way to warn him, some distraction that might give him a chance to escape, but the soldiers were being thorough and systematic. Just as two soldiers entered the house to begin their search, a new sound caught everyone's attention. From somewhere beyond the ridge that bordered Margaret's property came the thunder of hoofbeats, many hoofbeats, moving fast. Collins immediately became alert, drawing his sidearm and signaling for his men to take defensive positions. What the hell is that? He muttered. The sound grew louder, and suddenly a magnificent sight appeared at the top of the ridge. A herd of wild Mustangs crested the hill and poured down toward the ranch, at least 30 horses in a flowing river of motion and power. They were led by a magnificent black stallion with a flowing mane, and behind him came Mares and foals of every color, bay sorrel, paint, and palomino. Jesus Christ, one of the soldiers breathed. Look at them all. The horses thundered past the ranch buildings, close enough that the ground shook under their hoofbeats. They were wild and free, untouched by human hands, and there was something almost magical about the sight of so many magnificent animals moving together across the desert landscape. Collins and his men stood transfixed, watching the spectacle. Even their own horses were reacting to the presence of the wild herd, prancing and whinnying with excitement. Thunder and Zit-Dit-Gay were both standing at attention, their heads high and their nostrils flaring as they caught the scent of their wild cousins. I've never seen a herd that big, Collins said wonderingly. There must be 40 horses there. Look at that lead stallion, another soldier added. He's got to be worth a fortune if someone could catch him. The herd was moving away now, heading toward the water sources further south. As the thunder of hoofbeats faded, Collins seemed to remember where he was and what he had been doing. All right, back to work, he ordered his men. Continue the search. But the interruption had given Margaret an idea. As the soldiers resumed their systematic search of her property, she noticed something that made her heart skip. In all the excitement of watching the wild horses, no one had noticed that Zit-Dit-Gay was no longer in the paddock with Thunder. Somehow, during the chaos and distraction of the Mustang stampede, Joseph had managed to retrieve his horse and escape. Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed immediately by concern. Joseph was still wounded and shouldn't be traveling hard, especially not with soldiers actively pursuing him. Lieutenant, she called out, putting all the indignation she could muster into her voice. Are you about finished tearing apart my property? I haven't done anything wrong, and I don't appreciate being treated like a criminal. Collins looked up from where he was directing the search of a root cellar. The hidden compartment had been found, but it was empty except for the stores of preserved food and root vegetables that Margaret kept there. We found a bloody shirt, Mrs. Thompson, Collins said grimly. That's evidence of harboring a fugitive. That old thing, Margaret said dismissively. I found that caught on my fence line yesterday morning. Thought it might have blown in from somewhere. Didn't seem worth bothering anyone about. It was a weak story, but it was at least plausible. Collins studied her face, clearly trying to decide whether to believe her. The horse is gone, one of his men reported. The Apache mare we saw earlier, she's not in the paddock anymore. Collins cursed under his breath. How do we miss that? When did she leave? Must have been during all the commotion with the wild herd, the soldier replied. All that noise and movement. would have been easy for a horse to slip away unnoticed. Margaret kept her expression carefully neutral, but inside she was celebrating. Joseph had not only escaped, but had managed to retrieve his horse and probably gotten a good head start while the soldiers were distracted. Colin spent another hour searching the property, but it was clear that his heart wasn't in it anymore. With the horse gone and no sign of the Apache they were tracking, there wasn't much point in continuing. The bloody shirt alone wasn't enough evidence to arrest Margaret, especially since her story about finding it on her fence was at least possible. "We'll be back, Mrs. Thompson," Collins warned as he and his men prepared to leave. "If I find out you've been lying to me." "I wouldn't dream of it, Lieutenant," Margaret replied sweetly. "I'm just a poor widow trying to make ends meet on a failing ranch. I don't have time to get involved with Apache renegades." Collins gave her a hard look, but said nothing more. He mounted his horse and led his men away, heading south in the direction the wild Mustang herd had taken. Margaret watched until they were completely out of sight before allowing herself to relax. As evening approached, Margaret found herself alone again on her quiet ranch. Thunder was the only horse in the paddock now, and he seemed restless without his brief companion. Margaret knew exactly how he felt. She prepared a simple dinner and ate it alone, wondering where Joseph was now and whether his wounds were bothering him. She hoped he had found somewhere safe to rest and tend to his injuries. The encounter with the soldiers had reminded her just how dangerous his situation was. As she cleaned up the dinner dishes, Margaret reflected on the strange events of the past 2 days. A wounded Apache warrior had stumbled into her life, brought with him stories of loss and determination that touched her heart, and then vanished again like a desert mirage. She found herself missing his quiet presence more than she would have expected. Outside, thunder whinnied softly, and Margaret went to the window to check on him. The horse was standing at the fence line, looking south toward the desert. For a moment, Margaret could have sworn she saw a figure on horseback silhouetted against the sunset, but when she looked more carefully, there was nothing there. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the coyotes calling in the distance, Margaret said a prayer for Joseph Blue Hawk and his continuing search for his sister Ayana. She hoped that somewhere out there in the vast desert, he was safe and warm and not in too much pain from his wounds. She also found herself wondering if she would ever see him again. Their brief time together had awakened something in her that had been dormant since James's death. A sense of connection with another human being, a feeling of being needed and useful. It was dangerous to become too attached to a man whose life was so uncertain, but Margaret couldn't deny that Joseph had touched her heart in ways she hadn't expected. As sleep finally claimed her, Margaret's last conscious thought was of wild Mustangs thundering across the desert under an endless sky, free and beautiful and untamed. Somehow, the image seemed connected to Joseph in ways she couldn't quite articulate, but which felt profoundly right. 3 weeks passed without any sign of Joseph Blue Hawk, and Margaret tried to convince herself that this was for the best. He was searching for his sister, and she was just a brief stop along the way. Still, she found herself looking toward the horizon more often than usual, and thunder seemed to share her restlessness, often standing at the fence and gazing south across the desert. The quiet routine of ranch life had resumed, but Margaret noticed that small things had changed. The coffee pot seemed too large for one person, and the kitchen table felt empty with only her place setting. She caught herself preparing portions for 2 people, then having to eat leftovers for several days. It was foolish to miss someone she had known for such a short time, but loneliness, once acknowledged, was hard to ignore again. On a Tuesday morning in early October, Margaret was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Her heart skipped, wondering if it might be Joseph, but when she looked toward the road, she saw a different kind of rider entirely. A Mexican man on a tired-looking burro was making his way slowly toward her ranch. He appeared to be a trader, with various pots, tools, and bundles of goods strapped to his pack animal. Margaret had encountered such men before. They traveled between settlements and ranches, trading goods and carrying news from place to place. The man dismounted near her front porch and removed his wide-brimmed hat politely. He was perhaps 50 years old, with weathered features and kind eyes. "Buenos dias, señora," he said in accented English. "I'm Carlos Morales. I travel between the settlements, trading goods. Perhaps you have need of something?" "Good morning," Margaret replied. I'm afraid I don't have much to trade with these days. Maybe some eggs, if you're interested. Carlos smiled. Eggs would be very good, Senora, but perhaps you would also like to hear news? I carry messages and information as well as goods. Margaret's pulse quickened. What kind of news? Many things. Word from the settlements. Information about people who travel through the territory. Sometimes families look for lost members. Lovers search for each other. I help when I can. Have you heard anything about Apache people recently? Margaret asked carefully. I know there have been some troubles. Carlos's expression grew more serious. See, there have been many troubles. The soldiers moved the Apache people from place to place like cattle. It is very hard for families. He paused, studying Margaret's face. Why do you ask? Most white settlers do not concern themselves with Apache troubles. Margaret hesitated, then decided to trust this gentle-seeming man. I had an Apache visitor a few weeks ago. He was searching for his sister, who was taken by soldiers 5 years ago. I wondered if he might have heard anything. Ah, Carlos said, nodding slowly. You speak of Nailnish, perhaps? The one they called Joseph Bluehawk. Margaret's heart nearly stopped. You know him? I have met him several times in my travels. He has searched for many years for his sister Iona. A sad story. Carlos shook his head sympathetically. He came to me 1 month ago, asking if I had heard news of Apache women at the reservation near Fort McDowell. I told him what I could, but what did you tell him? Margaret asked urgently. Carlos looked at her with growing interest. You care for this man, Senora? Margaret felt her cheeks warm. He was injured when he came here. I helped him heal. I worry about him. Ah, see, I understand. Carlos nodded knowingly. The heart does not ask permission before it cares for someone. Yes, I told Nailnish that I had indeed heard of Apache women at Fort McDowell. But also, I heard that some have been moved again to a place called Carlisle in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania? Margaret was shocked. That's thousands of miles from here. See, exactly. They take the young ones very far away, to a school where they try to make them white. It is... Carlos struggled for words. It is a great cruelty to separate children so far from their families. Margaret felt sick. If Iona had been taken to this school in Pennsylvania, Joseph might never find her. And even if he did, what condition would she be in after 5 years of forced assimilation? When did you tell him this? Margaret asked. 3 weeks ago, perhaps a little more. He was camped near Tucson, and his horse was very tired. I suggested he rest longer, but he said he could not wait. He left the next morning, heading east. Margaret's mind was reeling. 3 weeks ago would have been right around the time Joseph had left the ranch. He must have gone straight to find this trader and learned about Carlisle almost immediately after his escape from the soldiers. Did he say what he planned to do with this information? Carlos shrugged. What could he do? Pennsylvania is very far, and he had no money for train fare. I think he was beginning to lose hope, Senora. 5 years is a very long time to search. Margaret's heart ached at the thought of Joseph losing hope just when he might have found a real clue about his sister's whereabouts. She also felt a selfish stab of disappointment. If he was heading east toward Pennsylvania, it was unlikely she would ever see him again. There is more, Carlos continued gently. I have other news that might interest you. What kind of news? About the Apache people who were moved from Fort McDowell. I have since learned that not all went to the school in Pennsylvania. Some of the older women were sent to the reservation at San Carlos instead. If this Iona was too old for the school, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. How old would she be now? When Nailnish spoke of her, he said she was 16 when taken. That would make her 21 now, too old for the school. She might be at San Carlos. San Carlos was much closer, perhaps a 3-day ride southeast of Margaret's ranch. If Iona was there instead of in Pennsylvania, Joseph might not be on a hopeless journey after all. I have to find him, Margaret said without thinking. I have to tell him about San Carlos. Carlos raised his eyebrows. That would be a dangerous journey for a woman alone, Senora. The desert between here and where Nailnish travels is not safe. Margaret realized what she had said and felt both embarrassed and confused by her own reaction. What was she thinking? She couldn't chase after Joseph across the Arizona territory. She was a 62-year-old widow with a ranch to maintain and no business getting involved in Apache tribal affairs. But even as she told herself these things, Margaret found she couldn't let go of the idea. Joseph had shown her kindness and respect during his brief stay. He was a good man caught in an impossible situation, searching for the last member of his family. If there was a chance that his sister was closer than he realized, didn't he deserve to know? How long would it take to reach the area where you think he might be? Margaret asked, if he is heading toward the railroad station at Lordsburg, thinking to somehow get to Pennsylvania, perhaps 4 or 5 days hard riding. But, Senora, you cannot seriously be considering. I have a good horse, Margaret said, her mind already working on the logistics. And I know this country well. My husband and I used to ride all over this territory. Alone? A woman traveling alone in Apache country? The soldiers would arrest you, or worse. And there are other dangers, bandits, wild animals, getting lost in the desert. Margaret knew Carlos was right. The journey would be dangerous and probably foolish. But she also knew she wouldn't be able to live with herself if she didn't try to help Joseph. He had touched her life in ways she was still trying to understand. And the thought of him pursuing a false hope across the country while his sister might be within a few days' ride was unbearable. What if I weren't alone? Margaret asked. What if someone went with me? Carlos looked at her for a long moment, then slowly began to smile. You were thinking of asking a certain Mexican trader to accompany you, perhaps? Would you consider it? I could pay you for your time and for guiding me safely. Carlos was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the risks and benefits. Finally, he nodded slowly. You helped this Apache when he was wounded and in need, even though it put you in danger. That speaks well of your character, Senora. And I know what it is like to search for lost family. You do. I have a daughter who disappeared during the troubles in Sonora 5 years ago. Bandits raided our village, took the young women. I never found her. Carlos's voice grew heavy with old pain. If someone had information that might help me find her, I would want them to share it, no matter how difficult. Margaret felt a wave of sympathy for this kind man who had his own losses to bear. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. How could you? But, yes, Senora, I will help you find Nailnish. We leave at first light tomorrow. Margaret's heart pounded as she realized she was actually going to do this. Yes, she said firmly. First light. The rest of the day was spent in preparation. Margaret gathered supplies for the journey, food, water, blankets, medical supplies in case they encountered Joseph, and found his wounds troublesome again. She also wrote a letter to her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, asking her to check on the ranch and care for the chickens while she was away. That evening, as Margaret and Carlos sat on her porch planning their route, she found herself thinking about Thunder. The horse had seemed restless and eager for adventure ever since Joseph and Zitdik had left. Perhaps he needed this journey as much as she did. You are nervous about tomorrow, Carlos observed, noting her fidgeting hands. Yes, Margaret admitted. It's been a long time since I've taken a trip like this, and I keep thinking this might be a fool's errand. Perhaps, Carlos agreed. But sometimes the foolish thing is also the right thing. Your heart tells you to help this man, see? Margaret nodded. I can't explain it. I only knew him for 2 days, but he touched something in you that had been sleeping since your husband died. Carlos finished gently. This is not unusual, Senora. The heart recognizes kindness and honor, even in strangers. Margaret was grateful for his understanding. What if we can't find him? What if he's already too far ahead of us? Then we try anyway. Sometimes the trying is more important than the success. That night, Margaret lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with doubts and second thoughts. She was about to ride off into the desert with a man she had met only that morning, chasing after another man she had known for only 2 days, carrying information that might or might not be accurate about a woman who might or might not still be alive. When put that way, the whole enterprise seemed completely insane. But then she thought about Joseph's face when he talked about his sister, the love and determination she had seen there. She thought about his quiet dignity in the face of pain and persecution, his gentleness with both horses and people despite all the hardships he had endured. 5 years was a long time to search for someone. Too long to give up when there might still be hope. Margaret rose before dawn and, dressed in her most practical riding clothes, leather boots, divided skirt, and her husband's old work shirt. She packed light, knowing they would need to travel fast to have any chance of catching up with Joseph. Thunder seemed to sense that something special was happening. He was alert and eager when Margaret led him from the paddock, his ears pricked forward and his eyes bright with anticipation. Carlos had transferred his goods to a pack mule and was riding a small, but sturdy horse that looked like it could travel for days without tiring. Are you ready, Senora? Carlos asked as Margaret mounted Thunder. Margaret looked back at her little ranch, the weathered house where she had shared so many years with James, the barn where Thunder had sheltered through countless storms, the garden where she had grown food for her family. It was possible she might not see it again. The desert could be unforgiving, and they were heading into territory where dangers were real and plentiful. But sometimes a person had to risk what they had to help someone else, especially someone who had no one else to help them. "I'm ready," Margaret said, and meant it. They rode south as the sun came up, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. Thunder's stride was long and smooth, eating up the miles with the eager gait of a horse that loved to travel. Carlos proved to be an excellent companion, knowledgeable about the country, alert to potential dangers, and comfortable with the long periods of silence that desert travel required. By midday, they had covered nearly 20 miles, following old Indian trails and cattle paths that Carlos knew well. They stopped briefly to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of bread and dried meat, then pressed on through the afternoon heat. "How far ahead do you think he is?" Margaret asked during one of their rest stops. "Hard to say," Carlos replied, studying the horizon. "If he left 3 weeks ago and has been traveling steadily east, perhaps 4 or 5 days ahead of us. But his horse was tired when I saw him, and he might have had to stop frequently to rest her. Maybe less." Margaret hoped so. Every mile they traveled took them further from her safe, familiar ranch and deeper into country where anything could happen. But Thunder was strong and willing, and her own determination hadn't wavered. If anything, she felt more certain with each passing hour that this journey was necessary. As evening approached, they made camp in a sheltered spot between two low ridges. Carlos proved skilled at finding water and setting up a comfortable camp, while Margaret tended to the horses and prepared a simple meal. "Tomorrow we should reach the area where the old Apache trails meet the road to Lordsburg," Carlos said as they sat by their small campfire. "If Nailnish is still heading east, we might find his trail there." Margaret nodded, staring into the flames. The desert night was cool and clear, with more stars than she had ever seen from a ranch. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft sounds of the horses grazing nearby and the occasional call of a coyote in the distance. "Carlos," she said after a while, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course, Senora. When you lost your daughter, how did you keep going? How did you not give up hope entirely?" Carlos was quiet for a long time, and Margaret thought perhaps she had asked too personal a question. But finally, he spoke. "The first year I wanted to die. I searched everywhere, asked everyone, followed every rumor and story. Nothing. The second year, I began to accept that she might be dead. The third year, I tried to forget and build a new life. But you didn't forget. No. How could I? She was my light, my joy. But I learned that there are different kinds of hope. At first, I hoped to find her alive and bring her home. Then, I hoped simply to learn what happened to her, to know her fate. Now I hope that wherever she is safe and loved." Margaret understood. It's hard to let go of someone you love. Perhaps we are not meant to let go completely. Perhaps love is the one thing that transcends distance and even death. Carlos stirred the fire with a stick, sending sparks up into the night sky. "This is why I help you search for Nailnish. Not because I think we will find him, but because the searching itself has meaning." The next morning brought a surprise. As they broke camp and prepared to continue their journey, Carlos spotted something that made him call Margaret over urgently. "Look," he said, pointing to the ground near a small water source they hadn't noticed the night before. "Horse tracks. Recent ones." Margaret knelt beside him to examine the prints. She wasn't as skilled at tracking as Carlos, but even she could see that the hoof prints were fresh, no more than a day or two old. "Could they be Joseph's?" she asked. Carlos studied the tracks carefully, following them for several yards in each direction. "The size is right for an Apache horse. And, see here." He pointed to a distinctive mark in one of the prints. "This horse has a small chip in her left front hoof. I remember seeing this mark when Nailnish's horse drank from my water barrels." Margaret felt her heart race. "He's close. Very close. And, traveling slowly, see how the tracks are spaced? This horse is tired, perhaps lame. They cannot be far ahead." They followed the tracks for the next several hours, Carlos reading the signs like words in a book. The trail led generally east, toward the railroad town of Lordsburg, but meandered somewhat as if the rider was unsure of his exact destination or was having to rest frequently. Around midday, they created a small rise and saw something that made Margaret gasp. In a valley below them, near a cluster of cottonwood trees that marked another water source, they could see a lone rider sitting motionless on his horse. Even at that distance, Margaret recognized the figure. It was Joseph, and something was clearly wrong. He was slumped in his saddle, and his horse was standing with her head hanging low. "Careful," Carlos warned as they approached. "He may be injured or ill." They rode down into the valley slowly, calling out so as not to startle Joseph. When they got closer, Margaret could see that her fears were justified. Joseph was conscious, but barely, his face gray with pain and exhaustion. His wounded shoulder had broken open again and was bleeding through his shirt. "Nailnish," Carlos called gently. "My friend, what has happened?" Joseph raised his head with obvious effort, and his eyes widened in surprise when he saw Margaret. "Margaret," he said weakly. "What? How did you?" "Never mind that now," Margaret said, dismounting quickly. "You're hurt again. Let me look at that shoulder." As she helped Joseph down from his horse, Margaret could see that his condition was serious. The shoulder wound had indeed reopened, probably from too much strain and travel before it had properly healed. He was also clearly dehydrated and exhausted. "You should not have come," Joseph said as Margaret began examining his injuries. "Too dangerous for a woman alone." "She is not alone," Carlos interjected. "And you are in no condition to argue, my friend." While Margaret tended to Joseph's wounds, Carlos examined Zitdik. The mare was in even worse condition than her rider, severely dehydrated, one front hoof cracked and painful, and showing signs of complete exhaustion. "She cannot travel further without several days of rest," Carlos reported. "Maybe longer." Margaret finished rebandaging Joseph's shoulder and gave him water mixed with a little whiskey from her medical supplies. "What were you thinking, traveling so hard with wounds like these?" she scolded gently. "Had to keep going," Joseph said between sips. "Information about Ayanna. Trader told me she might be in Pennsylvania, at a school." Margaret felt her heart leap. This was exactly what she had hoped to find, Joseph pursuing the wrong lead while his sister might be much closer. "Joseph," she said urgently, "I have news about your sister. That's why Carlos, and I came looking for you." Joseph's head snapped up, and for the first time since they had found him, his eyes were fully alert. "News? What news?" Margaret quickly explained what Carlos had told her about the Apache women from Fort McDowell, how some had been sent to the Carlisle school, but others had been transferred to the San Carlos reservation instead. "San Carlos is only 3 days from here," she concluded. "If Ayanna was too old for the school, she might be there instead of Pennsylvania." Joseph stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. "San Carlos," he repeated. 3 days. "See," Carlos confirmed. "I have traded with people at San Carlos. Many Apache people there, including women who came from other places when the soldiers moved them around." Margaret watched as a series of emotions crossed Joseph's face. Hope, disbelief, gratitude, and something that might have been relief. 4 or 5 years he had been searching with no clear destination, following rumors and half-remembered stories across hundreds of miles. Now, suddenly, there was a specific place where his sister might actually be found. "But I've been traveling east," Joseph said, as if still trying to process this information. "For weeks, heading toward the railroad. And now you can turn around," Margaret said gently. "Carlos knows the way to San Carlos. He can guide us there." "Us?" Joseph looked at her sharply. "You cannot come with me. Too dangerous." "I've already come this far," Margaret pointed out. "And you're in no condition to travel alone. Besides, you'll need time for your wounds to heal and for your horse to recover. A few more days won't make any difference." Joseph looked from Margaret to Carlos and back again, clearly struggling with conflicting emotions. Margaret could see gratitude warring with concern for their safety, hope fighting with the fear of disappointment that had probably become a constant companion during his long search. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why would you risk so much to help me?" It was a fair question, and one Margaret had been asking herself since she left the ranch. Looking at Joseph now, wounded, exhausted, but still determined to continue his search, she found she had an answer. "Because sometimes people need help," she said simply, "and because your sister deserves to be found." Joseph closed his eyes for a moment, and Margaret thought she saw his shoulders tremble slightly. When he opened them again, there were tears he was trying not to shed. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Both of you. I had begun to think that you would never find her." Carlos finished gently. Joseph nodded. 5 years is a long time to hope. "But not too long," Margaret said firmly. "Not if she's still out there waiting for someone to find her." They made camp there in the valley, near the water and the shade of the cottonwood trees. Joseph needed rest and medical attention, and Gay needed time to recover from her ordeal. Margaret was secretly relieved to have a day or two to rest as well. The hard riding had taken more out of her than she wanted to admit. As evening fell, and they sat around their campfire, Margaret found herself studying Joseph's face in the flickering light. The news about San Carlos had given him something she hadn't seen before: real, tangible hope. Instead of chasing shadows across the country, he now had a specific destination and a reasonable chance of success. "Tell me about San Carlos," Joseph said to Carlos. "What is it like there?" Carlos considered his words carefully. "It is not an easy place. The land is hard, the conditions difficult. The government provides little food or supplies, and the Apache people there have had to learn new ways to survive. But there are families there, people who help each other. If your sister is there, she will not be alone. And you think there's really a chance she might be there?" "There is a chance," Carlos confirmed. "The timing is right. Women from Fort McDowell were moved to San Carlos about a year ago. And the age would be right, too, if she was too old for the school in Pennsylvania." Joseph nodded slowly. "Then we go to San Carlos." "We go to San Carlos," Margaret agreed. "But first you rest and heal. And we make proper plans." As they prepared for sleep, Margaret felt a deep satisfaction that she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since James's death, she was part of something larger than herself, something that mattered. Whether they found Ayanna at San Carlos or not, she had been able to bring Joseph real hope instead of false leads. And if it did find his sister, Margaret smiled to herself as she settled into her bedroll. If they found Ayanna, it would be worth every risk they had taken to get this far. The desert night was peaceful around them, and for the first time in weeks, Joseph Blue Hawk slept without the weight of impossible distances crushing down on his dreams. The journey to San Carlos took them 4 days instead of the planned 3. Joseph's injuries, while healing, still limited how far they could travel each day, and Gay needed frequent rest to nurse her damaged hoof. But Carlos proved to be an excellent guide, finding water sources and safe camping spots that made the trip as comfortable as possible under the circumstances. Margaret found herself treasuring these days on the trail in ways she hadn't expected. After 3 years of solitude on her ranch, the companionship of Carlos and Joseph felt like a gift. Carlos was a natural storyteller, entertaining them around the campfire each evening with tales of his travels and the colorful characters he had met. Joseph, as his strength returned, revealed a dry sense of humor and a deep knowledge of the desert country they were crossing. More than once, Margaret caught herself watching Joseph as he tended to his horse or studied the landscape ahead of them. There was something about his quiet competence and gentle manner that reminded her of the best qualities in her late husband, while still being distinctly his own person. She tried not to dwell on these thoughts, knowing they were probably foolish, but found them returning despite her best efforts. On the morning of the 4th day, Carlos pointed to a line of mountains in the distance. "San Carlos," he announced. "We should reach the reservation by early afternoon." Margaret felt her stomach tighten with nervousness. After all this traveling and hoping, they were finally going to learn whether Ayanna was really there. She could only imagine how Joseph must be feeling. This was the moment he had been working toward for 5 long years. Joseph himself seemed almost unnaturally calm as they rode toward their destination. But Margaret noticed that his hands were steadier than usual on the reins, and his eyes never stopped scanning the horizon ahead. When she looked closely, she could see the tension in his shoulders and the way he held his breath slightly, as if afraid that breathing too deeply might somehow jinx their chances. The San Carlos reservation was larger than Margaret had expected. Spread across a valley between low mountains, it consisted of numerous small adobe buildings, corrals for horses and cattle, and several larger structures that appeared to be administrative buildings. Smoke rose from countless small fires, and she could see people moving about their daily business. Women washing clothes in the stream, children playing in the dust, men working with horses and cattle. They approached the main settlement cautiously. Although they had legitimate business there, Margaret was acutely aware that they were strangers arriving unannounced at a place where tensions between different groups ran high. Carlos had warned them that some of the Apache people at San Carlos viewed outsiders with suspicion, having learned to distrust anyone who might represent the government or military. Their arrival was noted immediately. Several people stopped what they were doing to watch the approaching riders: an elderly Mexican man, a white woman, and an Apache man they didn't recognize. Word of their presence spread quickly through the settlement. "Let me speak first," Carlos suggested as they dismounted near what appeared to be a central gathering area. "I have traded here before, and some people know me." An elderly Apache man approached them, his weathered face grave, but not unfriendly. He spoke to Carlos in Spanish, and Margaret caught enough of the conversation to understand that Carlos was explaining their business there. After several minutes of discussion, the elderly man nodded and gestured for them to follow him toward one of the larger buildings. As they walked, Margaret became aware of the many eyes watching them. Some faces showed curiosity, others suspicion, and still others something that might have been sympathy. Joseph walked beside Margaret, his posture erect, but his hands trembling slightly. "So many people," he murmured. "How will we ever find her among so many?" The elderly man, who introduced himself as Thomas Longfellow, led them to a large wooden building that served as a community meeting place. Inside, several Apache women were working on various tasks: sewing, basket making, and preparing food. They looked up curiously as the strangers entered. Carlos explained their mission in a mixture of Spanish and English, while Thomas translated into Apache for those who preferred their native language. Margaret watched the faces of the women as they listened to the story, seeing recognition and sympathy dawn in their eyes. Many of them, she realized, probably had their own stories of family members lost to the various relocations and government actions of recent years. "Ayana," one of the younger women said suddenly, her face lighting up. "Ayana, who sings the healing songs?" Joseph went completely still beside Margaret. "You know her?" he asked in English, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded eagerly and spoke rapidly in Apache to Thomas Longfellow. He listened carefully, then turned to Joseph with a gentle smile. "She says yes. There's a woman here named Ayana who came with the group from Fort McDowell about a year ago. A healer who sings the old songs. She works with the sick children mostly." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes as she saw the expression on Joseph's face. Hope, joy, disbelief, and overwhelming relief warred in his features. His knees seemed to buckle slightly, and she reached out instinctively to steady him. "Where is she?" Joseph managed to ask. The young woman spoke again to Thomas, gesturing toward the door. Thomas nodded and stood up. "She says Ayana is at the school building, teaching some of the children. She will take you there." The walk across the settlement seemed to take forever and no time at all. Margaret's heart was pounding almost as hard as Joseph's must have been. After 5 years of searching, of following false leads and 7